To close out this week's videos, let's take a closer look at 3 songs associated with the Magical Mystery Tour EP, double EP album. And that is All You Need Is Love, A Fool on the Hill, and Blue Jay Way. Let's start with All You Need Is Love. A John song that, as I said in the previous videos, was written for the big satellite broadcast that they did worldwide in June, the summer of 1967. What's interesting to me is the use of a collage of styles that sort of fit together in this tune. Again, indicating not only the kind of stylistic breadth and juxtaposition that happens in a lot of Beatles music, but also a kind of an avant-garde tendency as well, although here done in a way that is in no way kind of aggressively alienating, like a lot of avant-garde stuff can sometimes be, especially to a pop audience. You know, from a typical point of view, I mean, in terms of what's typical of the song, it's a contrasting verse-chorus song, very square-cut from that point of view. The lyrics, very philosophical. All you need is love. It really sort of encapsulates the whole idea of the summer of love. All you need is love. Maybe as people got older, they realized, well, you might need a little bit more than love, but love's not a bad thing either. Remember that the topic of love really goes back to Rubber Soul and the song called The Word. Remember, what's the word? The word is love. So when we look back, we can say this is hardly the first time they've done a kind of embrace of love as kind of the solution to most of what ails the world. So the lyrics are philosophical. If you're the kind of person who likes musical details, you might note that the song all the way through really seems to go along in 4/4 time, except at the end of every phrase there's a measure of 3/4. So interestingly, they drop a beat at the end of at the ends of phrases. So wherever you come to the end of a musical phrase, count a measure of 3. And that'll then it'll all work out exactly the way it's supposed to do. I can't tell you how many times I've presented this for other people. You know, sophisticated musicians who know the Beatles music who are surprised when they notice, oh gosh, I guess that is right. So there's this sort of irregular meter or irregular phrasing element of it that's kind of interesting that goes on here. But I think by far the most interesting part of All You Need Is Love is the way in which these different styles are brought together. It of course starts with the French national anthem, and then goes into the song All You Need Is Love, which in many ways is almost a kind of music hall sing-along kind of tune, you know, complete with sort of chromatic brass lines to make it sound sort of music hall, or you know, give it a style drawn from the past and past popular styles. And then when you get to the very end of it, the Beatles superimpose 4 different quotations at the end. If you listen very carefully, you can hear the tune Green Sleeves being played by the strings. Then you hear trumpets come in with a ba 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 da ba da ba da ba da. This didn't sing that very well, but you get the idea. Which is drawn from an invention by J.S. Bach. So you get this classical reference going on, you've got green sleeves going on underneath it, and then they sing Yesterday over top of it, and also She Loves You is sung over top. So you've got all of these. Oh, and In the Mood, Glenn Miller's In the Mood is also added in there with the saxophones. And so you get these 5 things all kind of melted together in a kind of a collage effect over top of the very ending of the piece, which is a kind of an avant-garde kind of thing. They're all in the same key, and nothing about it sounds grating or wrong or particularly avant-garde. It just sounds like a bunch of things being played together at the same time. So All You Need Is Love, probably seen as a pretty good example of where things were at in the summer of 1967. The Fool on the Hill, the Paul song from maybe the best Paul song out of the Magical Mystery Tour project, is another one of Paul's sort of Paul solo philosophical tunes. I mean, when you think about it, Yesterday was kind of mildly philosophical. You think about Eleanor Rigby, it was about 2 people who live close to each other, Eleanor Rigby and Father Mackenzie, who both of whom are longing for some kind of, you know, contact with others, who are very lonely. They're living right next to each other. They're lonely, but the only contact they have is when she dies, and he's shoveling dirt on her grave at the end. So it's a kind of an alienation. You know, there's a whole a school of thought that believes the closer you put people together in urban settings or various kinds of social settings, sometimes the more alienated and alone they can feel, ironically. And when you think about She's Leaving Home, that's about a kind of domestic alienation, right? Where a father and a mother and a daughter have somehow become so estranged from each other that the girl feels like she has to not just leave home but escape home in a lot of kinds of ways. So Paul, dealing with these various kinds of topics in this way, Fool on the Hill engages what you might call the idiot/savant topic. That is the person who seems to be, kind of totally, perhaps mentally unstable or unable to think and act in normal kinds of ways, a person who you might think is actually disabled, are they actually enabled in a way that makes them possible to see things that most regular people can't see? Pete Townsend takes up this idea with the rock opera, supposed first rock opera in 1969, Tommy, where, of course, Tommy is deaf, dumb, and blind, but has access to a certain kind of knowledge that most other people don't have, and so they seek him out in order to gain that knowledge and to learn from him. So here, the Fool on the Hill is perhaps the one who understands things better than the so-called normal people around him. The instrumentation is interesting again, the use of not only flutes, so that sort of indicates a classical connection, which by now is pretty standard in Beatles music, but also a prominent use of the harmonica, something maybe influenced by the use of the harmonica prominently by the Beach Boys, especially on an album like Pet Sounds. The use of the recorder for a big solo in the center of it. It sounds almost amateurish on purpose, that recorder does. Ringo's playing some finger cymbals. So there's a bit of interesting percussion going on. But again, I would take this as another take on the Paul solo song, even though in this tune, the other three Beatles are performing on the track along with Paul. It sort of falls in that succession of pieces. Finally, let's take a look at George Harrison's Blue Jay Way. It's a contrasting verse-chorus tune, and it's similar to his Indian songs, but now without Indian instruments. In fact, he's got the sort of eerie sounding organ that goes on there, some cello kind of taking the role maybe of what the sitar would have done before. There's a lot of studio phasing effects, by which I mean a kind of a swishing kind of sound on the vocals that enhances what I think is kind of the general trippiness of this particular track. It almost sounds like it's in a bit of a kind of drug fog, but when in fact the fog he's talking about is a fog that has come upon L.A. I mean, the autobiographical nature of it is he kind of wrote this song while he was waiting for some friends to show up and meet him to go out or to get together or whatever when he was renting a place in LA and the fog rolled in and they were having a hard time finding the house and all that. So he wrote this song while he was waiting for them. But the whole tune is very sort of otherworldly in a kind of way. It's like George taking the Indian sort of drone approach that he'd used in tracks like Love You Too and Within You, Without You, and now not using Indian instruments or percussion so much, but creating the same kind of ambiance to create something that sounds deeply philosophical, when in fact it really is almost a kind of a quickly composed, not very meaningful piece for George himself, but still it fits in this succession of tunes. So when we begin to knit them together, starting from Norwegian Wood, we can go to Love You Too, Within You, Without You, and then Blue Jay Way. Interesting when we get to the White Album, starting to talk next week, and then into Abbey Road, how a lot of the kind of Indian connection starts to kind of fall away. In other words, he stops making as many of these direct kind of references to Indian music, even though a lot of his lyrics retain the philosophical bent and in a very sort of Indian philosophical orientation. Well, let's just summarize what we've talked about in this week, thinking through 1966 and 1967. A lot of music to go through, I know, and even more music that I didn't get a chance to talk about. I think one of the things we can say about this period from going from Revolver through the end of 1967, A Magical Mystery Tour, is the move from the craft model to the artist model is now complete. We're no longer talking about a progression. They're there. They're as there and with the artist model as they're going to become. We can see this through looking at the lyrics, the use of styles, the use of diverse instrumentation, and the use of studio effects. We can also see an awful lot of, when I say use of styles, I mean an increased use of a lot of different styles, including kind of avant-garde approaches to both the studio sounds they get, as well as to the lyrics. Think about John Lennon reading off a circus poster, for example. They do not, at the same time, abandon pop models. However, it would be wrong to say that all the music is, crazy and way out. A lot of it retains some of the structure and some of the pop sensibility of the earlier music, and maybe that's why the experimentation they did during this period was so much easier for people to accept and enjoy, because they were still full of a fantastic pop sensibility and a knowledge of how to sort of really make these things appealing to a more of a general audience, and less to sort of music students listening to some composer's concert somewhere at a conservatory somewhere. They complete the move from live act to studio band. So there's going to be no going back to the Beatles tours, to the mop top screaming girls and all that kind of thing. That's over. That job goes to the Monkees, who at about the same time are sort of ramping up their television show at the end of '66 into 1967. So the Monkees become the Mop Top Beatles. The Mop Top Beatles grow their hair on their face, on their head, all that, and become more of a band that appeals to college students and the newly burgeoning FM radio in the United States. And the Monkees are now the AM band that appeals to teeny boppers and teenagers. And so there's a real difference in terms of audience between the Monkees and the Beatles. But this move from live act to studio band starts to lead to friction with George and Ringo. And what we'll learn about as we go into 1968 and 1969 is how both George and Ringo get frustrated with the situation and quit the band, because it's just not what it was. And what it used to be was a great performing live group. And when that couldn't happen anymore for those two guys, it was less interesting because John and Paul were running the show. So next week, we'll talk about 1968, India, and the White Album.